Hello everyone. This lecture is on Wolfgang Iser's The Reading Process, a Phenomenological Approach. So, Wolfgang Iser belongs to the Constance School of Literary Studies, named after the University of Constance, southern Germany. And unlike the new critiques, the Constance School of Literary Theory had concerns that were methodical more than being ideological or cultural. And this methodology of the Constance School is referred to as reception aesthetic in your mind. At least for now, you can link it with reader response. So, reading is emphasized as a constitutive element of the text. The Constance theory's main publication series, Poetics and Hermeneutics, one will note that hermeneutics is traditionally associated with theology. It involves a process that is directed towards meaning, right? Towards arriving at a meaning, and poetics is a kind of metalinguistic discipline concerning itself with models and structures available in special cases of language, for example, say literature, and therefore pertains to the formal analysis of linguistic entities, poetic structures, and so on and so forth. So, in hermeneutics, which is conceived, or which can be conceived as that which is concerned with the meaning of specific texts, reading is emphasized upon as a means of reaching that understanding or meaning. Thus, reading plays an important role. So, even though hermeneutics and poetics are different and distinct, they do entangle, and we will notice these points of entanglements when we in Wolfgang Iser's essay, The Reading Process, Phenomenological Approach. So, to continue then, the Constance School calls their approach a poetics as well as a hermeneutics, where it aimed for a synthesis of the two. And some scholars within the group were more inclined towards the Prague linguistic circle and phenomenology, like works of Polish philosopher Roman Garden, while there were others who found themselves inclined to philosophy of history and interpretation, in other words, hermeneutics. So, rather than structural analysis of language and consciousness. So, keeping this brief background in mind, we'll venture into Iser's The Reading Process, a Phenomenological Approach. Now, on this term phenomenology, very briefly, some ideas that can be outlined here. One of the central themes of phenomenology has been the Lebensschau, or lived experience, and that knowledge, or all knowledge that we have of this world, is inalienably linked to some experience of the world. So, phenomenology's interest lies with the question of essences, the essence of perception, the essence of consciousness. So, in Edmund Husserl's Cartesian Meditation, an introduction to phenomenology, Husserl notes that phenomenology is a philosophy for which the world is always already there as an inalienable presence. So, the phenomenologist seeks to understand, or you can say describe, this essential connect of man with the world. In other words, a return to the things themselves, and endows it with a philosophical status. In Iser's essay, he says that for a text to emerge as a literary work, for a text to emerge as a literary work depends on the realization of the text by the reader, or on the aspect of realization. So, even though the structure of the literary text may offer ways of reading the text, the actual realization of the same is a task of accomplishment by the reader. So, this suggests that in the final instance, the concretization, or let's say in the final concretization or realization of the work, depends not just on the artistic pole of the text, that is, the text understood as created by the author, but also on the aesthetic pole of the text, that is the accomplishment that achieved by the reader. So the text will offer two poles, one the artistic and the other is the aesthetic. Now this accomplishment by the reader, this further suggests that the work, and this is important for us to understand or make note of, the work can't be entirely identified with the literary text or with the text, nor can it be entirely identified with solely with the process of realization by the reader, but that which somewhere lies halfway between the two, right? And the work is brought about by some contribution made to it by the text, as well as some contribution made to it by the reader. So the literary work is the convergence, right, of the text and the reader that makes the text exist in the first place, that makes the text as a form of existence in the first place. So the core idea here is that the work is more than the text. It comes out to exist by the convergence of the text and the reader. It is neither identified with the reality of the text nor identified, or you can say materiality of the text, nor identified with the individual disposition of the reader, but rather a working of the two combined. And it is this convergence that brings the work into its existence. But at the same time, this point of convergence cannot be precisely pinpointed. This is what Iser states, describes, that it is difficult to pinpoint the exact point at which this convergence of something from the literary text and something from the reader takes place. So that it can't be precisely pinpointed accounts for the work's virtual dimension. This lends to the work its virtual dimension. Any literary work that is worth it ought to leave scope for this virtuality to play out. In fact, without the scope of this virtuality, a work is hardly possible. So if the literary work, let's say, is the whole, right? This whole never comes to you in the form of total amalgamation of its parts. So the whole, that is the end product, that is the literary work, that comes to form in your mind, that the impression that finally assumes shape in your mind as a whole, as this literary work, the conception of the whole that comes to form in your mind is always greater than the summation of its constituent parts. Now here we need to remember that eventually we will also say that not only the whole that you perceive, that or you form in your mind is greater than its constitutive parts, or is greater than the summation of its constitutive parts. We'll also note that eventually we'll note that this whole that is formed in your mind in a way is in a way does not contribute in any way to the exhaustibility of the work. So the work still remains inexhaustible. The work still remains something beyond the whole that is formed in your mind. So this is important for us to remember. We'll come to this latter point eventually, but at this moment let us remember that the whole that comes to form in your mind is always greater than the summation of its constitutive parts. And this whole is also a matter of result in your mind, and is never independent of your individual activity or creativity or processing. So Iser refers to what Lawrence Stern's conception of a literary text is, where it is this element of activity processing that the reader derives pleasure from a literary work and not get bored by it. So the reader's interest or involvement is necessary on the one hand for the whole to emerge, And the emergence of the whole is contingent upon the reader's active participation in the game of imagination that the work sets up, on the other hand. So Iser refers to Virginia Woolf's observation on Austen's fiction, where Woolf notes that it is the unwritten aspects of Austen's fictions that enables the reader to form realities of its own. So, on the one hand, this unwritten imposes a limit on the reader's, limit to the reader's imagination. It nevertheless stimulates the reader's imagination as well to make the reader supply the absent details in making or forming a background against which the work emerges with a greater significance than, say, it could possibly have on its own. So you see, phenomenology gives in to the understanding that your perception of the whole or reality, or say a literary work, for example, in this instance, is not based solely on some intrinsic factors that are inherent in the work itself. It is not a science, not even an act, but the background from which all acts stand out or is presupposed by them. So the literary work is not an object in the sense that you possess it. You possess the law of its meaning, but rather a phenomena of which you are a part too. So the work and you share some indivisible unity of value. This is the core phenomenological standpoint that we can remember in this context. So, in a way, the work is a phenomena of which you are a part too. So in that sense, the work and you share an indivisible unity of value. So you can refer to the text here, the last paragraph of the first section, where Iser writes, and I quote, yeah. Yes. At the same time, these implications, so this is the last portion of section 1, if you are having the text with you. But at the same time, these implications worked out by the reader's imagination set the given situation against a background which endows it with far greater significance than it might have seemed to possess on its own. In this way, the trivial scenes, that is, of Austen's fiction, suddenly take on the shape of an enduring form of life. So the text, at the situation of the text, is imparted a lifelikeness by the reader, and we'll come to it eventually in a greater detail. So what constitutes this form is never named, let alone explained in the text, although in fact it is the end product of the interaction between the text and the reader. So in the context of the literary work, the phenomenological analysis can be illuminated by what Roman Ingerden calls as the intentional sentence correlatives. So what does one mean by this Roman Ingerden's intentional sentence correlative? For example, so let's say that it points to the nature of sentence. It points to the nature of sentence in a literary work, say a novel, how the sentence works in a literary work or a novel. So the sentence here in say, for example, in literary work, right, is not just a statement or an observation or a claim or an information, but rather the sentence is qualified in some sense, in the sense that the sentence does not consist solely of a statement, but also aims at something beyond what it actually says or states, precisely for the reason that literary texts do not correspond to any objective reality outside themselves. So this is true of all sentences in literary works, where the sentence is beyond what it says, just like as we had just mentioned in the previous section, that just like the work is beyond what you have conceived of as the work, similarly the sentence in a literary work is is an indication of what is to come in the future. So it says something that is beyond what it actually says. Therefore the sentence is beyond what it actually says or states or makes an observation or something like that. So this nature of the way the sentence works in a literary work is understood as the intentional sentence correlative, where the sentence is an indication of what is to come or is an indication of the future, therefore the structure of which is foreshadowed by its specific content, and it is by supplying to that beyond that you construct the text in your mind by your own imagination. And by the process of what Edmund Husserl calls the pre-intention, that expectations get formed, get formed, and the interaction of these pre-intentions or the sentence correlatives will not fulfill the expectation, but rather they continually does not fulfill the expectation but rather continually modifies it, giving rise to what Iser goes on to explain, the formation of the process of anticipation and retrospection. So what you see, had it been the case that the expectations are fulfilled, there would have been a conformative effect where the text would submit to only one such individualization of a given expectation. The likes we have in texts that are expository in nature. But in literary texts, sentence correlatives do not form or develop in such a rigid way or manner so as to upload any one individualization of the text. Rather, the interaction in such a the sentences or the sentence correlatives, they interact in such a way that one sentence serves to open up a horizon which gets modified by the next succeeding sentence, and this subsequent modification further imparts a retrospective effect on the expectations that were previously anticipated or aroused. And in effect, what happens is a play of expectation formerly aroused and the possible modification of the same, leading to new expectations to form. And the previous expectation now, which is the property of memory, can't resume its original shape as it proceeds into a new horizon of an expectation. So what the reader is doing here is constantly oscillating between the past, present and future, revealing a multiplicity of connections. Now, this multiplicity is a result of the interaction between the reader and the text, and not the property of a text itself. For the property of the text, strictly speaking, is the sentences that are component parts of it, sentence, statement, etc. So this is what is meant when one says this is what is meant by when one says that reading is a creative process. We will see how Iser proceeds to calling reading not just a creative process but also that which has a dialectical structure to it. So you see, what happens or emerges from this process of to and fro movement of anticipation and retrospection is that the reader uses her own faculty to fill in the gaps that are resulted between the expectation and, say, the frustration of that expectation, something that in Garden refers to as the obstruction or hiatus in the flow of reading. So for the flow of reading to be maintained, it remains upon the reader to fill in the gap, resolve the crisis, make a decision, and contribute ultimately to the conception of gestalt of the work. For herein, the reading process bears testimony to the fact that the work is infinitely richer than any of its individual realization. So we come to a point, something that I mentioned earlier, that the whole that you form in your mind is not the whole in entirety but only a gestalt, which is a whole that is greater than the component part, and also the work which is similarly the work that is greater than your interpretation of the same, which lends and this is particularly that which lends the work its polysemantic nature. So the whole conceived in your mind is only of the virtual dimension, and it is this virtuality that lends to the work its exhaustibility, 2 its polysemantic possibility, and 3 its gestalt. So Iser refers to the example of time lapse that occurs in successive reading of the same text as yet another proof to his claim of the virtual dimension of the text, or the Gestalt formation of the text in your mind. You can refer to the end of section 2 of the text for this. And 2 more concepts that he discusses other than the time lapse is the picturization or picturing and illusion to further reveal the dynamics of reading. Before he moves on to discussing the concept of involvement. Again, this concept of involvement is quite analogous to what Georges Poulet analyzes as intimacy, if you remember, and consequently argue that the dialectics of structure of reading, whereby consciousness, or let's say the faculty that makes us aware of someone else's experience being experienced by ourselves, that is the authors, right? If you recall Poulet, leads not only to discover the unformulated, but also gives us a chance to formulate that which is unformulated. So coming back to the concept of picturing. Now this is a familiar concept for all of us. You see, no literary text that is interesting will supply every information or detail so as to leave you with no opportunity of imagining that which is somehow not conveyed through the written elements. So there is always an element of indeterminacy in the literary text that allows for your own imagination to form a picture. Unlike, for example, films, where you can directly see, for example, how the hero is or how the hero looks. The hero does not emerge before you through your own private imagination. So you see the hero, but you don't get to make up the hero in your mind. So in the process of reading, because of indeterminacies, the gestalt formed in your mind will always be colored by your own imagination. And this the writer achieves further by deploying the technique of illusion, or in other words, by satisfying the fulfillment of your expectation. So it is through the process of illusion building that your expectation seems to be aligned with the illusion, which enables further your comprehension, or in other words, enables you access or gives you access to the unfamiliar world of the text. So it is through the fulfillment of the illusion that you impose on the text some consistency or a configurative meaning. All this with simultaneous opposition that you experience in terms of the constant indeterminacies that are offered to you by the text. So Iser refers to the example of modern text that strive to frustrate the reader with its constant detailed supply of contradictions, thus paving way for a tug of war between the text provocation of certain expectation and the simultaneous cancelling of those expectations. So what you find yourself in is a struggle between your tendency to impart to the text on the one hand a configurative meaning. Again, you see, this is essential, your tendency to impart on the text a configurative meaning or a consistent meaning. Again, this is essential for the reading to continue and move towards a meaning or an impression or the formation of the gestalt, whichever way you put it. So on the one hand, your tendency to impart to the text a configurative meaning, which is inevitable, which is a requirement for comprehension to take place, and on the other hand, a simultaneous frustration engendered by the text. That is, a confirmation of the polysemantic possibility of the text, leading you to strike a balance between the two. So as the as the polysemantic nature of the text and the illusion making of the reader, these are two opposed factors. So it is through and it is this balancing that is called or termed as the aesthetic experience of the text. And it is through the balancing that one notices a constant shift of perspectives. So on the one hand, a consistent meaning is essential for the apprehension of the unfamiliar, for which process of illusion building is necessary. On the other hand, the consistency conflicts with many other possibilities of fulfillment that it seeks to exclude. So this is revealing on the one hand of the transitory nature of illusion that gets duly disclosed during your reading, and also the fact that in your balancing you reconstruct or recreate the text in the sense that you impart to the text dynamic lifelikeness. So as a perceiver, your perception is dependent upon the way you order the elements of the whole text in order to lend it a form. So Iser gives the example of the unreliable narrator, for example, a narratorial device often employed by author precisely to create this oppositional effect on the mind of the reader. So the unreliable narrator may give rise to perspectives which otherwise would not have been supplied by the mere narration, and this in turn causes to turn the reader against the narrator, with the reader finally making interpretative decisions on her own, compelling to not just recreate the text in the process but also the reader herself. Right. So we come to the final concept of this essay, which is involvement. Again, a very important essay, because from this we will proceed to what Iser talks about, the function of consciousness, or the element of consciousness, and then we will see the similarity that he shares between his idea of involvement and Georges Poulet's idea of intimate situation or intimacy. Okay, the process of reading, or reading as an intimate situation. So something that Poulet, what was referred to as intimacy by Poulet is referred to as entanglement by Iser. But again, Iser will note that this, let's say, Pouleian intimacy or Iserian, entanglement isn't a case of simple identification with the work of the author. So it is not a simple case of identification, because again in the formation of this entanglement, of the involvement of the reader with the work, and results in the disappearance of the subject-object division, and this otherwise the subject object division, which is otherwise a prerequisite for all knowledge and observation, this on the level of reading, or as far as the process of reading is concerned, if one recalls Georges Poulet, in the process of reading, this subject object division disappears. But again, as I said, that this subject object division, it disappears, results reading, or makes reading into a unique phenomena, does not necessarily can be labeled with the common literary notion of identification, because identification, what Iser says, is not an end in the process of reading, but one can understand it as a stratagem by which the author stimulates the reader. Now, if one remembers what Poulet had said about this this intimate situation, where one is compelled to feel that one is thinking somebody else's thought, and in order to think somebody else's thought, the self that thinks someone else's thought is someone else's thought, which is characterized as a strange thought, must also be a strange self. So the strange subject, who is also the thinking subject for the strange thought, in a way signals authorial presence. And to know this, or to be aware of this authorial presence, is a result of consciousness working its way. So you are conscious that you are thinking somebody else's thought. You are also conscious that you are becoming some, along with thinking strange thought, you are also a strange subject. So this consciousness is understood as the awareness of your strange experience, the experience of the strange self. So and one notes that the consciousness that forms the point at which the reader and the author converge results in the cessation of the temporary self-alienation that occurs to the reader when his consciousness brings to life the idea formulated by the author, thus establishing or paving a way for communication. Now, what Iser goes on to say further, that even though this analysis provides for a substantial, for a conception of consciousness constituting itself in a literary work, it cannot be that reading will remove the subject-object division that constitutes all perception in its entirety. Rather, what happens is that the subject-object division takes place, within the reader herself. So text and reader no longer confront each other as object and subject, but what happens is an artificial division of the reader's personality. And it is this artificial division of the reader's personality is important for us to understand, or it is something that provides, again, to repeat the former point, it provides the virtual background which makes it possible for the unfamiliar text to be familiarized. So it forms with the background. Now what Iser further goes on to say is that when one understands, when one is conscious, when one is aware that that the kind of formulation, okay, because you have to formulate the unformulated, you have to discover, let's say, the unformulated, in order you have to get access to the unfamiliar world. So your access to the unfamiliar world is again carried out by somebody else whose thoughts you are occupying, whose thoughts you are making yourself a subject of at your time of reading. But this also implies that the consciousness or the faculty that is responsible for formulating or responsible for familiarizing ourselves with the unfamiliar, in other words, something that Iser calls as the faculty for deciphering. So the implication is that this formulation of the faculty for deciphering at the same time cannot be along the reader's own lines of orientation. So what happens is that a dialectical structure gets revealed in the process of reading, where not only there is a need by the reader to decipher the unfamiliar, but also at the same time formulate the unformulated. Alright, so I think we can end here. Thank you all for listening.